Hello everyone, I am Diana Firinca speaking on behalf of ELSA Romania. I would like to thank ELSA Germany again for this opportunity and for gathering around our network for this unique event. Now moving to our lecture, I would like to introduce our speaker, Mr. Codin Moldovanu, that has been kind enough to accept our invitation for today. He is a former ELSA member that has been working in the international technology field for over 7 years now, presently being a cloud operations engineer at a French company. He will be talking about the concept of artificial intelligence and its impact on the number 10 goal of the United Nations, which is increased inequalities. I would gladly pass the floor to him now.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for having me. Hopefully, I won't go too much into technical details, but a few of them are very much needed so we can get a very good idea of what AI actually is and to get some of the hype around it, maybe get it gone fully. If there are questions, just please write them in the chat, and I think Diana will relay them to me, if I'm not wrong. Okay, that being said, let's start with, I have a little cheat sheet here that I wrote, so I'll kind of follow it so I don't stray too along the path. Let's start with what is AI. The Wikipedia definition says something like the field and study of intelligent agents and any device that perceives its environment and takes actions that maximize its chance of successfully achieving its goals. That's a very strongly worded one, but in more human terms, basically any machine that has cognitive-like features and is able to attain a goal that a human would in a very narrow field. At this point, we have narrow AI, so we have weak AI right now at this point, which means we can have machines that do simple tasks that are very well defined in very specific areas. We are not still at the point where we have a very large AI or great AI. I think that was the actual naming of it. Think of great AI as the one you see in movies, HAL 9000 or so on, Jarvis from Iron Man. Basically AI that is able to do multiple things in multiple areas successfully as well. So you won't be able yet to have a personal assistant that is perfectly compatible with anything you tell it. He won't be able to do something it hasn't seen before. He won't be able to learn something new just by default. Right now, everything in AI relies on training sets. So let's say you want to train an AI to recognize raccoons, which is one of the first things people learn doing with AI. For that, you first need to give it a data set of raccoons. So imagine you have an Excel sheet in which you have a lot of photos of raccoons, and then you have a lot of descriptions, basically, in which, yes, there is a raccoon in this photo, there isn't one in this, and so on. After you feed it that training set data, it will learn what a raccoon is and what not. The learning process is very much a black box process in which the AI tries to train itself based on seeing if it achieved the successes you put in that Excel spreadsheet. Further along, you have weights and biases, which are human inputs into it apart from the dataset. We have to return back to the dataset in a bit and talk about biases in it, but before we go to that, let's talk about weights and biases. Basically, some things matter more than most, so you want to give a different weight to something. That can lead to biases, which in turn leads to human biases, as they would be called. I think I'm straying apart from the path, so I'll just refer back to my cheat sheet that's supposed to keep me here. Okay, so I talked about training sets. Training sets are basically just data regarding anything you'd like to train the AI for. You can have a data set of pictures, you can have a data set of language, you can have a data set of poetry. You can basically have a data set of anything as long as you are patient enough to create that data set. I think recently there was the OpenGPT-3 model released, which has been trained data from basically all of the online publishing sources, and it has been able to recreate or actually generate an article based on one line of input and it would pass for being human. It scared a lot of people at the time. I think you can just search for OpenGPT. That's an example of training sets from online, from web publishing sources. Again, you can have in pictures, you can have basically anything at this point. The limits are there, but you just have to find them right now. Um, okay, so I did talk about models and training sets. Models. An AI model is basically a trained instance that is trained for a very specific thing. So you'd have OpenGPT-3 for language models. So for an AI that generates text and language for you, you'd have something else for one that detects something in pictures, and so on. I did write here, what is AI already doing? So right now, AI has been in production use in the medical defense and IT sectors, basically from mask detectors in public, which are very much the rage right now since we're living in this context, down to AI that is able to fly fighter jets, going along to the IT sector where AI is successfully detecting threats and mitigating them in real time. And basically, the fields are not limited by its capabilities yet. Right now, the fields haven't implemented AI, so we can see where the actual hard limits are. There is a bit of history that needs to be known about AI, since it has been cyclical and it's been proven to be cyclical, especially in this field. So back in the 50s, when AI first basically appeared, there were golden years, a lot of funding, a lot of hype over it. So research has been moving along very, very hard then. And then at one point, after overpromising and not delivering on the overpromises, uh, there was an AI winter in which funding has been cut. Besides cutting the funding, basically the computing power at the time wasn't simply strong enough to sustain the rhythm of growth that there was at the moment. So there was the first AI winter in which funding was cut, nothing was happening. That took about 6 years, if I'm not mistaken. And afterwards, there was another boom. New scientists came in the field, new promises were made, new things were discovered, and another boom took place over there. Funding, promises, everything took place once again. And yet again, a new AI winter came where Japan, I think, invested over $500 million at the time in the 80s. And once again, AI fell short of it. So the whole thing happened again, in which funding was cut and promises weren't delivered. And then in the 90s, AI started basically this era in which we're living now. So we're looking at over 30 years of progress that's been constant, and there's been no AI winter yet, which means funding is still available. And okay, funding is still available. Promises have been kind of kept so far. So there's been something they learned from the past experiences, in which they've been more reserved in what they say AI can do and can't do. And yeah, that basically gets us to the day to day, in which AI is constantly progressing and new amazing things are happening every day, from Tesla's self-driving cars to deep fakes and so on. So of course, there's always going to be bad actors. So technology can really be used for everything in between. Let's go back to my little cheat sheet that keeps me in check here. Limits, what it can do yet. Okay, so I've talked a bit about what it can do. It can detect if you're wearing a mask. It can detect if a parking space is open. It can even detect if someone shows signs of tiredness or being sick or so on. What it can do, it can't yet be used for very large things. So an AI that detects if you wear a mask won't probably be able at this point to tell if you're also exhibiting signs of sickness. Once you get it out of that very specific area of expertise, it will very, very fast lose its ability to actually work and give you successful output. It's not necessarily thinking about the great AI I talked about earlier, since we're talking just about a little deviation from what its specific purpose is. But the models right now are being trained on very specific sets of data, so you won't be able to actually go further than what you've trained it for. It won't know how to react to it, and the results usually are disastrous when you try feeding it an image. By feeding it an image, I mean you have a model that you've trained, for example, to actually detect masks. Feeding in it an image would be basically telling it, okay, what do you see in this picture? Do you see a man with a mask, or do you see a sick man? The results, once you stray further from that, will be disastrous. It won't tell you anything remotely. It might not even recognize the mask. So right now we have very, very narrow AIs in practice that actually work successfully. It can't also do great tasks like carrying a conversation. Despite there being language models that can properly do that and can actually generate text that feels humanly generated, it's still not able to consequently do that. So at one point you'll notice little quirks in it that basically, let's say, destroy the castle or the impression of the castle. Besides not being able to have that great AI, there are still some some sectors in which its use has been tried, although with a lot of talk from the public community regarding it. At one point, there was a trial of using it to basically training an AI with images of former convicted people of different crimes. It has been tried to use that model dataset to estimate what the chances of a random person being assigned to the AI, given feeding into it basically, based on the image, to decide what is the probability of that person committing a crime in the future. And as you could expect, that led to a lot of discussions in the public community regarding biases and so on, since your main problems, yeah, the main problems in any AI system is the dataset. So if you have a history, for example, yeah, I'll go with that same example still. So if you have a data set of convicts and it's not perfectly equalized, it's not perfectly normalized, so you don't want extremes in data, you don't want something to be here and something else to be here. If you don't normalize that, that thing will go basically into the model, and the model will also have that bias in which something is more important than the other. And I think you can see how that's a very big problem, especially in the implementation that they did of trying to estimate what the probability of something committing a crime is. So biases that are made by datasets or by humans are extremely important when while we are going forward with AI. So a lot of attention has to be paid to the datasets we're feeding them, because the biases in our systems can be found in the datasets, which is a huge problem. And basically, if we're not solving this at this point, this will be seen for the rest of the AI era. But luckily, a lot of people are working on this, so it's not that big of a problem right now, or that big of a concern. Back to the cheat sheet right here. Oh, the effects on humans. Yeah. Basically, from here, it's going to be a lot of my opinions, a lot of the opinions of people I've read. So, yeah, take everything with a grain of salt, since we really don't know, and everyone basically has opinions at this point. We know a bit of what happened so far, so we have a pretty decent idea of what might happen, but still, no one knows the future. We can just slightly predict it based on the history of it. Although that's not ideal, but that's what we have to work with. So far, the effects on humans haven't necessarily been great, as you could expect. You can see right now AI in the forms of your Facebook newsfeed, for example, which isn't ideal, especially since the Facebook algorithm is especially tuned for more screen time. So if it sees that you are reacting by spending more screen time on a certain topic, the chances are it'll show that news topic more to you, since you're spending more screen time. And for that AI specifically, or algorithm, success is defined by the amount of screen time it gets from you. So that's an example of AI that isn't necessarily in our best interest, but still exists. Facebook has been very, let's say, shy talking about it. It names it an algorithm, but a lot of people online have shown how it's possibly an AI model, which isn't that far from an algorithm, basically, but the distinguishment is pretty important between them. Other effects on humans have been job losses in specific sectors that require low levels of cognitive input, so very repetitive tasks. For example, a lot of them have been automated or are being automated as we speak. Interesting here is that not only low cognitive input tasks basically are being replaced, even slightly more complex and amazingly hard tasks are being automated by AI. Of course, there's also an automation part, a physical automation part that's taking place at the same time, without which it wouldn't be possible to even implement this and affect the job market. Yeah, so a lot of low cognitive input tasks are being automated by that. Think of someone trying to look at the treadmill with objects, just checking if they're okay. Most of those jobs are slowly being automated since it's very, very easy and efficient for an AI to look at a picture of an object on a treadmill and say if it has any cracks on it, or if it's bad, or if it doesn't look right, the color isn't good, the shape isn't good. The fact is the AI can go so much further. So it could basically look at a picture, say if it's slightly larger in this area, so this product shouldn't go out to human consumption, and so on and so else. So that's one of the examples in which a lot of jobs that were previously available are now starting to disappear, since the power for AI is here to actually take those jobs. And comparing to the 1950s when it appeared, we now do have the computing power needed to run AI basically even on our phones. And while at it, it's way too much even on our phones for what AI needs. The most computing power an AI needs is training it. After you train it, it doesn't consume that much power. So when everyone talks about how much computing is needed for an AI, they're talking about training it. After you've trained it, there is no issue with power consumption whatsoever. So back to the cheat sheet. Oh, yeah, so my opinion there was that the loss in low cognitive input tasks will basically force an evolution of everyone, since those jobs won't be as many as before. Something needs to happen there, and the natural thing would be people getting better at higher cognitive input tasks and competing in different job markets and a different level of the job market. Again, this is very much speculation because we don't know, and this is also very reliant on the environment, which the UN is really trying hard to make better for everyone. So the strategic goals, so the 10th strategic goal was reducing inequality within and among countries, which is very reliant on all of the other goals, but I kind of made a note here to underline that no poverty, quality education, gender equality, and partnerships for goals among all of the others are also very important, and they kind of all work together, especially in this in the field of AI. You kind of need all of these and the rest, but I underline these ones. You need all of them to be able to progress with AI, to lead it into a good area and to take a good path with it for the future, and also to have a sustainable growth of this sector, since the chances of this sector affecting basically whole societies, not necessarily something specific like one job market or the other. The chances of it affecting the whole society are huge. I'm not sure if it is very well known about it, but the potential is limitless at this point. Hard limits have not yet been entirely found. Hard limits have been found when using bad data sets or data sets that aren't enough. So far, you can basically use it to do almost anything. Luckily, lawyers aren't in the category that will soon be replaced by AI, so that's a good thing, I guess, for us and for you. Back to the cheat sheet, because I am drifting away from the topics. Okay. Okay, yeah, so that was the bad part. What can happen? Basically, a job market collapse could happen if AI progresses and the equality between countries isn't really attained, and good working conditions and good living conditions and good health and good education. That will most definitely lead to a lot of it's a paradox. If action is not taken right now, this inequality will only be enlarged, since right now there is still quite a big disparity between countries and how much they're contributing and what their AI knowledge level is and how many great minds they have in their country. All of them are really influenced by the UN strategic goals, in which people would have a quality education, people would have no poverty, people would have good food, people would have gender equality, and they would have also partnerships for the set goals. So apart from the possible or potential job loss, which should be able to be avoided in some ways, we do have good things as well. So we have AI that works in the medical research area. A lot of things have been happening recently regarding that, including with SARS-CoV. I think SARS-CoV-2 was one of the topics in which AI has been working a lot. People haven't yet been extremely successful to it because, again, the problem is the data set. So being something relatively new, people are still normalizing the data and receiving it and trying to put it all into a format so they can have something good to work with. But I'm sure a lot of interesting stuff will come out of this afterwards. I wouldn't know by heart any projects in which it was involved. I vaguely remember it was involved in multiple ones, and the success was pretty mixed, but 50% plus one, basically, in most cases. What was I? Okay. Oh, another risk and danger that I kind of overlooked earlier was the deep fakes, which has right now is being used in a day-to-day world. Everyone is basically using an app such as FaceApp or all of the face swap things. All of those are basically using this technology. It doesn't fall into the category of AI since it's been able to be done so good right now. So it's not really considered that anymore, but it is using the same methods. So on one side, you wouldn't want to call it AI, but it is. So all of the deep fakes, if you don't know what they are, it's basically swapping a face or swapping a speech or replacing something original with something that is not original and having no way basically to tell apart if it's an original or if it's not. There was a very popular clip of Barack Obama saying the lyrics from Imagine, I think. It looked perfectly real. And the problem is those things can also easily be done by bad actors. So you would be able to say very bad things and maybe do very bad things at the time. The imagination in what bad thing could happen if you have basically a video, let's say a video call with someone, and you look like totally someone else. So that can lead to privilege escalation. That can lead to a lot of incredibly bad moments. Unfortunately, there's no real way to combat this at this moment. There's no way to actually distinguish between what is a fake and what is not, except for maybe looking at trusted sources. Although even those can happen to be penetrated and used by malicious actors. So there is a real possibility of, let's say, a Twitter account being hacked and a fake AI video being placed on it. And from your part, it would all look okay. So you'd have a Twitter account that you trust, it has the little verified checkmark on it, and it has a deep fake video on it. You wouldn't be able to tell if it's fake or not. That can lead to huge problems, and the solution to that is still being thought of, I think, and I guess, since there's basically no way to solve that at this time. And it has been used in even horribler ways than that. I did talk a bit about the unsustainable job markets that could happen if everything persists like this and equality isn't really attained, since you do need a lot of partnerships between the countries to be able to pull together and get more of AI and mitigate the risks of AI, which right now are still pretty important. A lot of markets depend on not very highly cognitive tasks for their job markets, and a big part of the world does as well. So that's a real problem because objectively speaking, it is way cheaper for an AI to do such work, but at the same time, we need to consider what an AI doing those jobs would entail. So, is it worth it for a company to have a 70% reduction in costs, but at the price of 10 people working those jobs? So, those are more philosophical debates that need to happen basically at this point. Oh yes, I had a mark here to talk about the effects on inequalities. Basically, it's somewhat of a paradox at this moment, since the inequalities between countries, which I talked about earlier, do lead to more inequalities, especially in this sector. It's very much in a domain in which everything is progressing very, very fast. So if you're not up to speed with everything, it'll take you a long time to get up to speed. And afterwards, the problem will basically be that you'll be months behind what others are doing. So you won't be able to have the latest technology and fight from the same uh, from the state plate, basically. All of the UN strategic goals are kind of working towards that, and it's admirable, honestly, and I really hope it happens. If we do manage to reach those goals, AI will surely reduce inequalities since everyone will be on the same leg. Everyone will have the same knowledge about it. The same philosophical discussions will have been held already. So some countries won't necessarily just go and basically ruin their job markets or societies as a whole using AI in certain sectors that would have basically been talked about in philosophical debates among countries as well. So if the strategic goals are being attained, the paradox won't happen, and people will safely be able to use AI in a lot of domains, and debates will be held on an international level about what you could use it in and what you couldn't use it in. I'm guessing even then there will still be a lot of issues with datasets, which is still the main issue AI has. I kind of want to search for a link to give you, but that's not really how it works. But basically, if your dataset is bad or has outliers in it and has examples that are not indicative of the general way your dataset is, that will ruin how the AI thinks. So think of it like a baby that sees only one thing happening, and then something totally different and off the charts happens. It'll remember that and he will be influenced by that. That's exactly how the AI will also work. So if you have a data set with something, with an outlier, with something that isn't specific or isn't necessarily related to your behavior, you're feeding it and you're learning it, that will be a big problem. And basically, AI won't work. And further along, that will ruin funding over promises, and basically, we're going to reach an entire AI winter once again, which luckily we haven't so far, although the hype is kind of dying now, very, very slowly, but it is. Dun, dun, dun. Let's look back at my little chart here. Okay. Yeah, I did talk a bit about biases and weights earlier. Basically, there are three parameters that I'm just going to go back to this one, and then I'll give a word to Diana if she wants to say something. Or okay. So biases and weights are two of the three possible inputs a human could give to an AI. The first one is the dataset, which is the human prepared data to learn the AI, whatever it wants to learn or prepare for. The second is a bias, and the third is a weight. So the bias is what we know as a bias, basically, in which this result is more favorable than the other. So you give it a number bias of something, an element in your dataset, and then the weight of it is the importance of that bias that you give it, if you want it to be under-considered or over-considered. Basically, these are the only three things that an AI gets to learn anything about anything and maybe notice max. Basically, anything you give it is very much controlled by these three parameters and nothing else. What happens during the learning period is that it tries to get to the success rate you specified in the dataset. That really means that it's a black box in which you have no idea what's actually happening, and you just get the output. I think there are like a few people on the planet that actually understand what's happening in the black box while it's computing that and while it's learning it. But it's a very much a black box for a lot of us. Diana, I hope you have
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, I actually had a personal question regarding exactly this matter. And just to conclude, would you say that even if a proper, really proper data set is fed to a machine, he would still get to some biases just based on its experience? Let's say that um, he will get on the conclusion alone that some people are more qualified for a job, even though the data set has been neutral included.
There are certain models which are continuously learning. So, depending on the implementation, there is a chance of biases being developed. If you have a model that is continuously learning and it will continuously see that something or a type of person doesn't get into the certain job that it wants, the bias will slowly be developed. But that's only in the case of AI networks that are recurrently learning stuff. So you have the model that you trained with your dataset, and afterwards, if it continues learning from all of the input it gets, the problem will slowly start developing by itself. If you're not using such an AI network in which it learns from all of the input it constantly gets over time, then the problem won't really be there. But you're also missing out on training it with a lot more data that you're naturally gathering.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. I think an hour was a bit too much because I don't want to get into technical stuff. And the philosophical debate could basically go on endless. What should I talk about further?
Okay, so I would also have a second question. What would you think that should be the implication of the public sector regarding to the implementation of IE, and how could it help to stop reducing the inequalities by their implication?
It's very hard to tell how the public could basically, if they're not data engineers or scientists or people working in the field, it is very complicated for them to actually get involved in this. It's more of a possibility of them getting involved to find ways to mitigate the risks that it entails, since the inequalities very much stem from the risks in this domain. The powerful, the more powerful the AI gets, then the bigger risks there are. So people that find ways to mitigate that risks are equally important to scientists developing the networks. So I'm guessing one way for the public to get involved in mitigating the inequalities would be finding people that are interested in mitigating the risks and finding solutions for people who are at the risk of losing their job because of the advancements AI is making right now, or finding ways to basically improve data sets and so on. That would be one of the way in which the general public could in a very real way, improve the inequality problem that is able to arise because of AI.
Okay, and how would you think that the government should have an implication regarding all this? Maybe develop some programs, um, offer some new jobs exactly in the public sector.
That's very complicated. Basically, the government should very much be supporting all of the development that is taking place right now, but at the same time, going back to the strategic development goals, the quality education part is very important, since that develops people in all of the areas needed to have a very sustainable growth of people and the sustainable growth of the domain, and not only the, let's say, computer science domain, since you very much do need philosophers to talk about these things and realize what the solution would be and how hard or how good or how easy it would be to go one way or the other. So basically, the government could solve this by improving the quality education and following all of the UN strategic development goals. And further along, it could open new job sectors in its areas for things that, in a very socialist way, it could open things that can be automated but would provide jobs in the market. Further, it would be a problem for philosophers and political commentators and other people to actually find and identify ways of moving those people from those jobs into others. Again, this
Thank
is
you.
very much just my opinion, so don't quote me on it. I think I've touched basically all of the topics I've laid on my little cheat sheet here. I've basically been able not to stray too far from it, although 1 hour was a bit too much for a slightly non-technical talk about this subject.
Hi, good morning. I'm from ELSA Germany in Heidelberg. Thank you very, very much for the presentation, and thank you, Diana, for the questions you asked too. So maybe I'd suggest, as you just mentioned, that the presentation you'd prepared hadn't necessarily gone too far into the technical detail, but as it is a topic that you're obviously well educated on, are there maybe further aspects that you'd like to talk about that you didn't necessarily prepare in advance, but you do, but you can mention further and talk about further?
In the AI sector specifically,
Yeah, exactly. So anything in like basically in regards to the presentation, but perhaps in a broader spectrum.
okay, I kind of need to think about those. Well, one of the things I really wanted to touch about in this presentation, and one of the main reasons I was looking forward to speaking, was kind of debunking some of the myths of what AI can do and can't do, and how it can. There are like two big impressions of it. So you have Jack Ma on one side, which thinks AI is going to go rogue and basically cause a lot of damage, and you have on the other side you have Elon Musk, which thinks AI is going to save us all. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the middle, not really on either part of the world. And there is a lot of hype regarding what AI can do. So people just go, AI can do anything. AI can't do anything you can't properly explain for it in a data set. If you can, whatever it is you want an AI to do, if you can provide it the tools and the data set to learn that, there's a high chance it will work. Even then, the slight chance of it not working is very real. So very much the problem with what AI can do is limited, but what you can have in a data set, from poetry to music to driving cars and so on, flying planes even. That was one of the things I was really looking forward to talking about. I did touch it a lot in the start of the talk. What would be except for that? Basically, the chances of it going rogue are nil at this time, since we're not nearly at the level where we have a general AI that is able to have own thoughts. There have been experiments in which two machines have been talking to each other in code that only they would understand, but it's very much just a ping pong game for them at this point. We're not at the point where they can have ideas or they can understand what a human is, or what the dangers to humanity are, or what they could do to survive. The idea of survival in AI doesn't exist yet, fortunately. After that exists, then we could be looking at something a bit more scary, but until then, we're perfectly safe. So AI can do a lot of things that you could, if you can basically describe it in an Excel sheet, the chances are, yes, you'll be able to train it for that.
Okay, thank you. But then maybe to latch onto that and to bring that point further a little bit more. So fortunately, AI isn't at a point yet where it will go rogue and we need to worry about that. But it is at a point where it can be misused by people who perhaps are either reading the data set wrong or manipulating data sets. So maybe going more in that direction, especially considering that we do have, for example, police forces using artificial intelligence or learning mechanisms and data learning mechanisms. Maybe you could talk on that a bit more, just because it is such an important topic in regard to human rights protection, to make sure that artificial intelligence isn't misused, even if it's not going rogue by itself.
Yeah, that's a very high risk, and that's a very present risk at this time. So one of the risks would be the malicious use of it, which I touched upon with talking about the deepfakes. One of the cases would be that. Another case would be malicious actors manipulating datasets, which is way worse than the deepfakes in a way, because it is very hard to spot a bias in an AI system. After you've trained it, you have no actual way of telling what's it thinking and what its biases are. Once you've trained it, you have no idea. So a malicious actor manipulating a data set and feeding it into an AI is a recipe for disaster that you have very slim chances of actually getting and actually noticing it. That is a very, very high problem right now. And the systems you've mentioned, the artificial intelligence surveillance systems that are being deployed in use in multiple countries right now, that's also a very real problem, because again, it's all a problem with data sets very much. There hasn't been systems like these in place in a lot of countries. I remember the UK has a very large network of CCTV cameras. So the UK would be one of the few countries in which you would be able to actually have a data set of people on CCTV in the same areas, committing crimes and not committing crimes. So there you would have a very good data set, basically, of people behavior. But not a lot of countries do have that. So they don't have that large, that extensive system of CCTV cameras. So the datasets will very much be biased for it. If you're developing, for example, an AI that tries to spot weird behavior or criminal behavior, it will very much be a problem if you don't really have that data set, because it will be very easy for an AI to see a person in a crowd and think it's doing something totally different than it actually is. As for the facial recognition features, that's still, it's not very far away. It's very close, but again, it relies on data. If you do have a good picture of the person, you have very good chances of success, since techniques could be used and multiple AIs could basically be linked together. So you have, let's say, an AI that spots the criminal behavior and just extracts a very slow, very low resolution photo from that crowd. Further, that can be passed to another AI that enhances the image, very much CSI-like, and gets a better resolution of the picture, which can then be related to the forces to actually go and apprehend that person. So there are, of course, ways in which it can go very good and it can be useful to society, but there are also very real ways in which biases could destroy lives.
Yeah, thank you. To just immediately respond to that, because I think you mentioned a topic that's really important, which we could maybe talk about a little bit further now, is obviously with keeping in mind that, for example, the United Kingdom does currently have a really expansive CCTV system in place. I think it's really important to also talk about responsibility and who ends up being responsible for what the AI does or how the data sets are used, which we're provided with. Do you maybe, obviously it's quite the expansive and quite the large question that can't be answered just within one conversation and two people. But maybe catching more into the direction of what can we do to avoid that such negative things happen. Do you think it's a question of policy making, of jurisdiction, more a question of who we allow to use these kind of softwares?
So you mentioned who is basically responsible for it, and that's a very, very, very good question, since the only person, so you would have the people preparing the dataset on the one hand, you'd have the people creating the model on the other, and then you'd have the people deploying it. From my perspective, the people deploying an AI are at no fault whatsoever for what the AI does, except if they see it do it continuously and don't act upon it. So the responsibility there would be on the data set and the people creating the model, but in a lower percentage than the people creating the data set. As for mitigating those with policies, I don't think, usually I think policies inhibit research and make people afraid of touching certain areas. One of the main reasons we've basically been able to have in the last 20 years a huge boom in AI research, I think, is specifically because of very low to none policies in this sector. So people didn't, or researchers didn't hit laws that are prohibiting them from using data sets. Elections have been won and lost, especially because there weren't any policies in this area. So you have the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal that happened. Think of all of that data as a data set. So people were very easily able to train an AI. If a person likes this and this and this, then he's a Republican or he's a Democrat or whatever. Policy needs to be created, but the job of creating policy that could mitigate that seems to me basically impossible at this point without stifling innovation and research that is also happening. The lack of policies has enabled the very, very fast growth of the sector. At the same time, I'm pretty sure it can also very, very fastly inhibit its growth. Your question was structured in a couple of parts, but I kind of forgot the second part, I think, or the third.
No, that was pretty much the question answered. So the main point I was trying to reach was what we can do, and especially opening up that kind of worms and talking about policymaking. And maybe that is an important question to talk about more in detail now too, just because having to, which is, I mean, it's a very lawyer and law student thing to do, to have two different options in front of you and you have to figure out which one we're going with. And looking at this, obviously we can pull comparisons to every other field such as psychology, where obviously there was quite large innovation when there weren't any policies, but looking back now at, for example, experiments which were done in the 60s, it's quite easy to see from our point of view now that they should not have been conducted in the way that they were, and we just didn't have policies in place at the time to regulate it. So maybe in 10 years we're going to be looking back at GDPR and at AI issues from 2020, thinking, oh my God, how could that have happened? So maybe it is even considering that it would stifle innovation in some senses, maybe it's still the right thing to do to create policies quickly to prevent any further human rights harm, for example, happening.
I think it's very hard to identify an actual thing that's happening that's bad, so policymakers would actually move on the subject and deploy policy in place, since at this point it's very much invisible things that are happening. So one person doesn't care if their data from Facebook is leaked and all of their behavior patterns get leaked, because you're just one person. You think you don't care. But if 500 million people's data is getting leaked, that's a data set. So that's an actual issue. GDPR was, I think, one of the first things that could basically stop AI researchers from having data sets. When it came into force, a lot of people started having the debates on, can we still get this data? Because before GDPR, everyone could just have a camera on the street and take photos of everyone, despite it not really applying in that case, but metaphorically for the example, I'll just use it. Before that, anyone could have like a camera on the street and taking photos of everyone passing through in front of their block, and then have a data set of people. After GDPR came in, that was suddenly a problem, and a lot of publicly shared data sets that were created basically in this way have gone under and have disappeared off the face of the internet, and basically 90% of the case. So I think the policymakers are still at a point where they haven't identified who the actual victim of it is. So I think that's one of the main reasons for which policies in this sector, like outlawing some behaviors of them, have not happened. What they should possibly do is pay a lot of attention to AI that shows bias. So if you have an AI that tries to find crime and you constantly find innocent people instead of guilty people, then that's a real issue, because you're destroying lives in the end. So that's where a lot of regulation would have a place, in which the quality of the AI would be evaluated and further upon improved, or measures taken to stop the AI going haywire and just ruining lives in the end, basically.
Yeah, and I think that actually goes in a really, really interesting direction of the potential future possibility of there being like a robot judge, and potentially actually within the legal field, many many jobs that we see as absolutely normal, that it's a human being doing them, potentially at some point being replaced by artificial intelligence. Obviously, that's quite far ahead in the future, and nothing we need to be worrying about today. We definitely still have secure jobs for the next few years. But I think with the point that you mentioned a second ago, in regards to not really finding, and maybe policymakers not exactly knowing who's being harmed, once it's a data set that's not necessarily going in the direction of, for example, artificial intelligence having a bias towards or against a certain gender or race. I think one aspect that definitely should be considered, though, not for AI in total, but anything relating to essentially to money, because these data sets are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And I mean, you mentioned Cambridge Analytica. It's so much money that states could have, and that could be used for communities, could be used, for example, I think Barcelona a few years ago, we saw what can happen when you ask the citizens of a city, how do you want the city to adapt? How do you want it to change?
Yeah.
And just maybe if there's any policymakers listening right now, or anyone that knows policymakers, there's quite a lot of money that's currently being held by private entities and by companies that could potentially, once GDPR and once this entire topic of data sets not belonging to a company, but private data belonging to private individuals, I think that would very much shift the way we view data sets in the future. But I mean, I've noticed it too for anyone that's grown up with computers. And I mean, I've grown up in a generation where it's absolutely normal that I've had a Facebook account since I was like 12, even though the community guidelines stated you had to be 14, but everyone had one. And I think many people that have just been so and grown so accustomed to having all of your data online and available 24/7, and we use our face to unlock our phone and our fingerprint to unlock our phone, and we have our location on so that Google Maps works more efficiently. I think many people have reached a point where they maybe don't even realize how relevant and how essentially how much their data is worth. And maybe one topic that would just be important and could be breached by policymakers starting to talk about it more would just be sensibilization of everyone, more in
Yeah.
the direction of what's happening here and what the broad spectrum of things is, how much data is worth, and maybe just shifting the entire social discussion towards that direction again.
There are a lot of initiatives that focus on privacy. There are quite a lot of open source communities that focus on the privacy of people. So there are efforts going in that place in which people are trying not to use Google and they're using DuckDuckGo, or they're not trying to use Android phones. They're using open source variants of Android. So Google doesn't have access to all of your telemetry and location data and phone data, SMS data, basically everything that you're currently giving away without that without the contract being in front of your eyes. By just buying a certain brand of phone, you're giving a lot of data back to the creator of the phone or the operating system on an implicit agreement that you have with it. And a lot of it you won't even know about unless you're just looking at the traffic your phone is sending back home. And the main reason for that, they will say it's telemetry. So if an app crashes, they want to know about it so they can fix it. But at the same time, the data is there. After it leaves my possession, I have no idea how it's going to be used. So what you said about policymakers trying to sensibilize people on the worth of their data is extremely important, and would lead to a lot of good things happening, and people not being breached as hard, and people being more secure about having their accounts and not losing their passwords and using two-factor authentication and so on. On the other side, what allowed AI to have this explosive growth was exactly the lack of specifically GDPR, because it was very easy to get a data set and everyone was creating them. And now we're at the point where a lot of people with a lot of money have them. There are a lot of open source ones and free ones on the internet, but they're not as many as before. And it's at least an afterthought now when developing a data set that, okay, do I have permissions from these people to anonymize their data and then use it here? Okay, maybe I won't put this on the internet. and it just goes underground, and basically it still gets shared, but not as easily as before. There are a lot of AI models that have been trained on data that is sketchy to say the best, but impressive results have come out of it. So there is a case to be made there as well. Even if you use data that's not ideally from the legal standpoint, amazing things have come out of it. For example, the OpenGPT model, it read basically all news sources that it could find on the internet. It's not necessarily legal to do it in that way, since a lot of them have paywalls and they have terms and conditions that specify you're not allowed to access the site with a crawler, so you can't programmatically get the data on this website. It most probably did. We have no idea to say that certainly, but I don't imagine someone manually went to the New York Times' website and just copy and pasted it. So a lot of the sketchy data sets do help the sector rise and do advancements in the field. And one of the things that I do recommend is reading the Guardian's article on, not on, actually, that was written by an AI. I have it around here somewhere, I just need the title. Oh yeah, so the article is named "A Robot Wrote This Entire Article, Are You Scared Yet Human?" That's one of the examples of what OpenGPT-3 can do, and it's fully written by an AI. So every word you'll find in there is written by a computer. You won't be able to tell it was, because it sounds very human and it sounds very warm, and it's impressive and scary at the same time. But then after you get back in the idea that, okay, AI can do what it was prepared to do, it'll be more soothing for your heart knowing that they won't conquer us tomorrow. So the main taking point is that AI can do whatever you prepare it for. So if you prepare it to do bad things, it will do bad things. Luckily, 99% of the people are training it to do great things, and I really hope it succeeds. And I hope it won't be stifled by a lot of policymakers maybe not being prepared enough or not understanding the sector enough to create policy that will basically allow AI to grow into something great that's helping the UN strategic goals, for example, and not something that will enlarge the inequalities between countries, between groups, and so on.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And I think it's really important that just, especially if policies are going to be put in place the next few years, it's ones that are done properly and with expert, and not policies done that are going to cause many protests from people that understand the topic in a different sense and in a better way. But I also think, especially just considering that if we have good scientists and we have people that want to make great things, we've seen in history over and over again that potentially without policies you do get a bit further. But I think it's a discussion that's going to keep us very engaged the next few years, especially just weighing up and talking about the different aspects of it. What overweighs, what do we need to focus on more? But I'm very excited. Thank you so much for your presentation and giving everyone such a good overview and a really good understanding too of obviously your opinion, but a really nice overview of the topic. I think this is definitely an important step in the direction of sensibilizing people towards it too. So thank you so much, and thank you as well to ELSA Romania for organizing this slot of our 24 Hours for Human Rights live stream.
Thank you for the chance.